My adoptive mother sat me down before the wedding and told me that if I owed her that much, I had to call it off and convince my fiancé to marry her biological daughter. The incident I will talk about is between my stepmother, her biological daughter, and me. I, a 25-year-old woman, had been living with my stepmother, Mary, a 45-year-old woman, since I was 5 years old. My biological mother was an alcoholic and extremely abusive to me. My dad, tired of her behavior, filed for divorce and demanded full custody of me due to her negligence. Unfortunately, her issues couldn't be proven in court, so both parents shared custody, with my mother having me most days. However, her negligent behavior soon took its toll when, one day, she left me alone at home and I accidentally accessed the balcony. My neighbors noticed this and called Child Protective Services, and from then on I started living with my dad. Things were difficult at first, but once he met Mary, everything changed for the better. Mary was my dad's attorney's assistant. They met during divorce proceedings and began a relationship shortly after. Mary, who was also divorced, had a daughter, Jane, who was 2 years younger than me. Jane suffered from a neurological condition and was permanently wheelchair-bound. I met Mary and Jane when I was 4 years old. At first, it was a little awkward because I had been quite closed off to strangers because of my birth mother. However, Mary understood my situation and took things in stride, helping me open up more. Over time, I became extremely close to her and Jane in a matter of weeks, and that's when my dad decided to marry her. Their wedding, as far as I remember, was very intimate, with only my grandparents and Mary's parents present. I used to call her Mary before the wedding, but since then I've called her Mom because, even though she didn't legally adopt me, I've always seen her as an adoptive mother. Things started to look up for us from that point on, as Mary opened her own practice and my dad, who was a construction worker, opened a construction company. Soon, his business prospered and thereafter we never faced a day of adversity financially. Both Jane and I went to the best schools and had good lives. I always considered Jane my sister, helping her with whatever she needed and standing up for her whenever necessary. Even Mary felt like the only mother I had had since childhood, because she had always been there for me. I have been extremely grateful to her my entire life, because she was the reason I was alive and thriving, and I have never stopped showing it to her. We moved to a much better neighborhood when I started high school, and that's where I met my boyfriend, Ryan. Ryan lived 2 blocks away and was my classmate. We started going to school together once we realized we were from the same area, and we became good friends. He used to visit my house quite often and got along well with everyone, especially Jane. He was one of the few people she felt comfortable with, and we all had a lot of fun together. Late last year, he asked me to go out with him and I accepted. When I told my family about this, everyone seemed happy, except Jane. From that day on, Jane was frequently irritated with me and we didn't talk much. Mary saw Jane's behavior and attributed it to the recent change in medication. I understood and decided not to talk to him much to avoid fights and give him less stress. Ryan and I applied to a lot of colleges and luckily we got accepted to the same one, which was pretty good. Everyone was delighted with our achievement, and Ryan and I couldn't be happier. Jane was still a little distant with me, so I decided to talk to her before I left and clear everything up, because after all, she was family. After talking for hours, I realized from the way she talked about Ryan that she had a crush on him. It all made sense, but I wasn't going to leave my boyfriend to work things out, so I decided not to broach the subject at all. Jane and I came to an agreement before I left, and I was satisfied with that. Before I left, I told Mary that I thought Jane had a crush on Ryan and that it would be helpful if she talked to Jane to avoid any more problems between us. She assured me that she would take care of it and told me that I could always count on her support. I got emotional at the thought of leaving my mom, and we both cried a little in the kitchen. A few weeks after that conversation, I left with Ryan to set up our room at the university. The next 4 years were great academically. I learned a lot, I excelled in most subjects, and I got some internships before my peers. Overall, I was doing well. On the other hand, my relationship with Ryan was not at its best. We had had problems since the beginning of college and were in an on-off relationship most of the time. I also heard some rumors that he had cheated on me. So, by the end of college, our relationship was pretty shaky. Given our history, We both mutually decided that we should take a break for a while to get our lives back together. I came home to rest a few months after finishing my degree and told my parents about the breakup. They weren't as surprised as I thought, but that didn't seem strange to me. Jane was also about to finish high school and asked me if I could have Ryan talk to her because she was planning on studying the same degree and needed guidance. I was a little reluctant to call Ryan so soon after our breakup and suggested some of my friends in the same field, but she insisted that she wanted to talk to just Ryan. So I decided to put my feelings for Jane aside and sent her a message. After talking to her, Ryan called me and told me that Jane was flirting with him during the call and that he wasn't interested in her that way. I told Mary, and she said it shouldn't be a problem for me because Ryan and I had broken up. I didn't think much more about it after that. A few years later, Jane was about to finish college and I was working, still living at my parents' house. I ran into Ryan while shopping, and he was well settled and enjoying life. We started chatting and met again several times for lunches and breakfasts, eventually rekindling our relationship. A few months later, he asked me to marry him, to which I obviously said yes. The news of our relationship was not received as we had hoped by Mary, and Jane's anger was also understandable. But it was the news of our engagement that wreaked havoc on my house. Jane had a huge tantrum, which led to an anxiety attack, and she had to be taken to the emergency room. She was fine, but due to her predispositions, the doctors asked us to take good care of her and not introduce stress to her. After discussing it with Mary and my dad, we decided it was best for me to move. I moved out shortly after the incident and used to go home on weekends. Jane had now accepted my engagement and was quite excited about the wedding. She was originally going to be my maid of honor, but after her reaction to the engagement, I decided to let her be one of the guests. Everything was going well with everyone, especially Mary, who was trying to get involved in every little detail of my wedding and was also paying half of the expenses. I couldn't be more grateful to her for everything, and I even mentioned it in my speech at the rehearsal dinner 2 days before my wedding. The night of my rehearsal dinner, everyone was drunk beyond reason, and Mary asked to speak to me privately. I thought it would be a mother-daughter conversation, so I suggested we talk in my room. I didn't expect what was about to happen. Mary sat me down and started telling me how grateful she was excited to have a daughter like me, which made me feel emotional. He went on to say that he had similar wishes for Jane, but that it was very difficult, and he began to cry. I comforted her and she asked me if I loved her. I said yes. Then he asked me if I owed him my life. It was an absurd question, but I answered yes again. Hearing this, he got up and asked me for a favor. When I asked him what it was, he said that since I owed him everything I had, he wanted me to share a little of it with my sister Jane. I was confused and asked him what he wanted me to share. What he said next was far from normal. He said that compared to Jane, I had a much better life, while Jane was surrounded by only a few, one of which was Ryan. He claimed that he had known about Jane's attraction to Ryan since childhood, but did nothing about it until we broke up after college. She went on to say that Ryan was a very understanding man and perfect for Jane. He asked me to break off my engagement to Ryan and ask him to marry Jane instead. I couldn't believe my ears and asked him to shut up, but he didn't. He said this was the only way he could repay him, as he had accepted me as his own blood and cared for me as his own daughter. She said she wanted Jane to have a relationship for the future too, and Ryan was the only man she was sure wouldn't break her girl's heart. I knew Ryan wasn't interested in Jane that way, so he wanted me to convince him. I couldn't process what was happening, and in a fit of fury, I kicked her out of my room while she screamed that she should consider it, and that she would be indebted to me for life if I did this for her daughter. Her screams attracted some attention, and my dad came to ask me what was going on. I didn't respond and just left him and Mary outside. I cried in my room and didn't realize when I fell asleep. The next day, I woke up late and my dad asked me to come see him in his room. Mary was there with her eyes swollen from crying. He said that what I did last night wasn't right, and that treating Mary, the woman who raised me, like that and kicking her out wasn't something I had the right to do. I realized at that moment that I didn't know anything about what Mary had asked of me. When I was about to tell her, Mary grabbed my hand tightly, telling me not to tell the truth. I let go of his hand, and before he could say anything, we heard a scream from Jane's room. He had fallen in the bathroom and had cuts on his legs. We didn't have enough first aid supplies, so my dad decided to take her to the emergency room as soon as possible and discuss the problem with me and Mary later. Since that moment, Mary has been begging me not to tell my dad the truth and to avoid damaging their relationship. I do not wish to engage in conversation with her and have been staying in my room. Am I a bad person if I don't give Mary another chance to explain or apologize before telling my dad what she asked of me? Update 1. Thank you for such a kind response. I initially realized that Mary was to blame, but I began to doubt myself after my father tried to intervene. I have decided to follow the advice in the comments and will talk to Ryan first before my father. Some have wondered why he wasn't aware of Mary's intentions previously, considering he knew Jane had a crush on Ryan. The thing is, everyone, including Ryan, thought it was just an innocent crush and nothing more. There was never a time when Ryan had reciprocated Jane's feelings with actions or words. However, I think I should have been more careful with the signs. One thing that seems strange to me now is that during my dress shopping, Mary also decided to give Jane a wedding dress to fulfill her wish of seeing her 2 daughters in wedding dresses. This could have been due to the difficulty Jane might face in finding a husband. Due to her condition and people's prejudices, Jane was fine, with some cuts on her legs that were well attended to. She didn't know anything about what Mary had asked of me, and she honestly didn't know how she would react if she found out. When I went to see Jane after she returned, I saw Mary in the corner. His face turned pale as soon as I called my dad. I had to ask him for the car keys to meet Ryan. Mary became unwell at the scene, as I suppose she thought it might give her away, so I helped her to the bed. My dad decided to stay by her side, silently blaming me for her condition. I didn't have time to explain anything to him and left immediately after taking the car keys. I'm writing this part after meeting Ryan. I went and asked him to meet me at the car to avoid unwanted attention. He could tell by my voice that it was something serious and ran downstairs. I told him everything that had happened the night before and let him know that maybe Jane's little crush wasn't so little after all. He was more surprised than I was, because I had always greatly respected Mary for being such a wonderful woman and such a loving mother to me. He said that such a revelation would lead to a lot of problems, so the best option would be to postpone the wedding for a few weeks. He made it very clear that no matter what, he is on my side and is willing to run away if that's what it takes to be with me. I wanted to be there while I told my dad about this, but I asked him not to, since it was a family matter first. He agreed and asked me to call him right after I finished talking to my dad. He would announce to his guests that the wedding was postponed due to some personal problems. Although I am happy to have someone like Ryan by my side, I am still scared because the scenario could lead to strained relationships with my dad, who has always been there for me from day one. I already lost a mother yesterday and I'm not prepared to lose a dad too. Update 2. A lot has happened since the last update. I gathered all the courage I could and went back to tell my father the truth. Mary opened the door and let me in, but she didn't seem as stressed as before. I walked into the room and saw my dad sitting on the bed with Jane lying there. He seemed angry and asked me to sit down. He told me that he knew what had happened the night before and was extremely disappointed in me. I asked her what she was talking about and she told me that Mary had informed her how I had scolded her the night before, saying that she wasn't my real mother and that Jane wasn't family, so she didn't want to have them at the wedding. According to my dad, when Mary tried to calm me down, I told her I didn't want her disabled daughter to ruin my wedding photos. I couldn't believe how clever Mary was. I tried to tell my dad the truth about Mary, which surprised him, but he said this was a case of my words against Mary's, and there was no way he would believe one version over the other. So maybe we should figure it out for now. Jane was constantly saying that her mom's side of the story was right, and she was now sure that Mary had told her daughter the truth and asked her to take action. I made it very clear to my dad that the wedding had been postponed because I didn't care who he thought was telling the truth. It was absolutely unacceptable for me to have someone who had tried to emotionally manipulate me into giving up the love of my life. Mary quickly intervened and said she wanted to apologize if she had done anything wrong while raising me and wanted our relationship to have a second chance with them being part of my wedding. My dad was also insisting that I should go ahead and let the wedding happen smoothly because a lot of money had been spent, but I decided not to heed his requests and left. That same day, I went to Ryan's house and 2 days have passed since then. I didn't really have the energy to deal with anything, so I turned off my social media accounts. Now I have not been contacted by my dad or Mary, but I have received calls from some family members that I did not answer, assuming they must be about canceling the wedding. Things are pretty stressful right now, and I hope to find a way to resolve them soon. TR update. This update comes a week after the last one, when the wedding was postponed and I moved out of my parents' house. A week after the constant calls, I found out from Ryan, who is a friend of my dad on Facebook. Apparently, my dad had posted something on his wall about me. After our relatives tried to find out the reason for the wedding cancellation and got no answers, they decided to press my dad and Mary on the matter. They tried to contact me to make a public announcement as a family, but since they couldn't reach me, my dad made that post on Facebook. In the post, he mentioned how he, Mary and Jane were pleading with me not to ruin their reputation over minor family issues, and hoped I would respond since talking was the only way to resolve it. This post made an already complicated situation even worse. Our family members and all their friends on Facebook were now speculating about the problem and spreading rumors. The worst rumor I heard was that she had stolen wedding money and then cheated on Ryan. Ryan was getting stressed out about all of this, and I talked to him thinking he might be having second thoughts. But to my surprise, he assured me again that he was going to marry me no matter what. I still hadn't responded to the Facebook post and planned to talk to my parents the next day to at least be rational before the big confrontation. However, things took a different turn that same night. I received a call from my grandmother, my biological mother's mother. I hadn't mentioned it before because it wasn't directly related to the incident, but it has been an important part of my life. He has always protected me and saved me from my mother, and even helped my dad financially. He usually doesn't get involved in our affairs, but his intervention in this incident meant that something big had happened. Apparently, she had found out everything and directly confronted my father about it. He told her what he believed to be true, Mary's version. My grandmother trusted me and felt that there was something strange, so she decided to talk to me about it. I knew how much I loved Mary and Jane, and I couldn't believe that I had considered them not family. I was excited to think that someone in my family finally believed my version, and I told my grandmother everything. She said she couldn't believe how cruel Mary was and how she had saved me from her evil intentions. I told her how I was afraid of losing my dad, and she asked me to talk to my parents first while she tried to find a solution. The next day, I decided to go home and talk to my parents. I was blamed time and time again for making a spectacle of our family. Honestly, I was exhausted of them in just a few minutes and asked if I could have a moment alone with Mary. We went to another room and I asked her why she was doing this to me when I had loved her all my life. Before you ask why I didn't record the conversation, my phone fell and the screen broke, and I still haven't fixed it. I couldn't ask Ryan for his since he uses it for work. Plus, I didn't expect Mary to confess something. But back to the point, she said that what she had said was something she had been feeling and that she never wanted to burden me with it. He asked me to forget it as a mistake and move on. I said that his loss of control, which he justified by alcohol, and his excessive request were not acceptable under any circumstances and that I was going to stand up for the truth no matter the consequences. This led Mary to warn me about the repercussions. Hearing this, I went out and asked my dad one last time if he was even willing to believe my version of what Mary had asked of me. He said that what I blamed Mary was very serious and that it was not possible for him to believe something so vile, especially from the woman he had loved for so many years, was impossible for him. Anyway, I had my answer and I stormed out of his house. The next thing I heard was that they were telling people that I had abandoned them, so they were also cutting contact with me. I've been talking to my grandmother, so Ryan and I are visiting her at her country house this weekend. Update 4. I'll start this update with good news. Once Ryan and I arrived at my grandmother's beautiful house, she suggested that since my parents had created this situation, we should consider eloping and getting married in her garden instead of the original wedding. Ryan thought it was a good idea and called his parents to ask permission. They were very happy with our decision, so the next day, my grandmother called her local priest and Ryan and I got married. He announced the news to everyone through his Facebook. The post received some comments, but we decided to review them when we got back home. My dad and Mary also saw the post and recognized the background, so they started bombarding my grandmother's phone with calls and messages. My grandmother responded by reminding them that they were the ones who started speaking badly about me, so they shouldn't be surprised now. She ended the conversation after that. After the event, I told my grandmother what had happened at my parents' house and asked her if she had any plans. She asked me what I wanted, and I told her very clearly that, after Mary's supposed threat, I wanted to expose her to my dad, assuming that Jane already knew what her mother was up to. My grandmother then revealed her plan. He said that he had a considerable amount of money from his divorce years ago, and that he would use it to say that he was going to give it to me to start a new life after my parents had abandoned me. According to her judgment, she was sure that my dad and Mary would want a share of the money, and she would pretend to give it to them if Mary confessed. Since I had nothing to lose after marrying the man I loved and having a family with my grandmother, I decided to give this a try. The next day, my grandmother called my dad and informed him that she was going to give me her money because they had cut off contact with me. As I expected, they were surprised and wanted to talk in person. So the next afternoon, my dad, Mary, and Jane arrived at my grandmother's house. They congratulated Ryan and I, but not much else happened after that. Mary asked me to speak privately. He started talking about how my life was finally at peace with my marriage and all this new money. I asked her what the purpose of the private conversation was, because I didn't want to interact with her unnecessarily. She said that what he had done that night had been extremely inappropriate. I asked her to clarify what she had done, because I wanted her to feel ashamed that she had ruined my relationship with my father and Jane. He clearly apologized for asking me to leave Ryan and convince him to marry Jane instead. She went on to say that it was all her maternal instinct, and that was the reason we were having this conversation. And yes, this time I was prepared and was able to record it. Although I ultimately didn't need the recording, I hoped she would say something along the lines of that I was also her daughter, that she felt remorseful and wanted to make amends by telling the truth. Instead, he told me that the money he had now could help Jane settle down and have a better future. I didn't interrupt her and let her continue. She kept trying to convince me to give half the money to Jane, because I could earn more, while life was already harder for Jane now that the love of her life was married to me. This was the least he could do for her. I didn't say anything and started looking at the kitchen door behind her. I don't know how, but it must have been God's will that, halfway through the conversation, my dad had come looking for us and decided to stay quiet and listen to what Mary was saying. She didn't realize he was right behind her. She was too busy explaining herself to notice my dad's presence. As soon as I looked at him after Mary finished, she realized that he had been there the whole time and what a huge mistake she had made. Mary tried to cover up what she had said during the conversation and instead revealed a lot more about how she had known all of this for a while and was doing everything for Jane. My dad immediately called Jane and asked her if she knew about all this. Seeing the stressful situation, Jane realized that it was better to tell the truth. My dad turned to me and started apologizing for not believing me in the first place. He told Mary and Jane to leave the house as soon as they could the next day, because he had a lot to think about. Mary tried to plead citing Jane's condition, but my dad wouldn't listen to anything. I asked my dad to go rest in his room because it was too much to take in. Ryan accompanied him, while Mary and Jane decided to stay in another room until they left. No one offered them sympathy, and we could see that Mary had seen it coming. I cried that night thinking about how bad things had gotten and how we were a happy family a few months ago. Ryan comforted me by saying that he would be my real family from now on. The next day, Mary and Jane left, and my dad left 2 days later, apologizing profusely for not trusting me from the beginning. I told him that his doubts about me could have damaged our relationship and that we should take things slow from now on. He seemed discouraged, but agreed to give me some space. Ryan and I also left that same day, thanking my grandmother for everything she had done for me. I asked her to come stay at my house for a while, and she could visit us next summer. Update 5. Since many of you have been asking about what happened with my dad and Mary, here I am writing this update 4 months later. My dad decided to divorce Mary, but he still wanted to stay in Jane's life if she wanted him to. However, Jane wanted nothing to do with him, partly because Mary had told her not to be in my father's life if they divorced, because it would be too painful for her. This speaks to Mary's nature. If she can't have my dad, no one else can have him anyway. Mary tried with all her might to get my dad back, but she couldn't despite her efforts. To clarify something, my grandmother did not give us the money. That was just part of the deception. My grandmother does not plan to put me in her inheritance, at least that I know of.